Welcome to Killer Psychologist. I'm Dana Anderson, a forensic psychologist and your host of the show. Killer Psychologist is for true crime fanatics and anyone intrigued with the dark side of psychology. Welcome to the Killer Psychologist Podcast. I'm your host, Dana Anderson. And you might think Killer Psychologist is all about a psychologist that wants to talk about why people kill or talk about serial killers. And that is a common assumption that people make. If you make assumptions, you might be wrong. And a lot of times people make assumptions and then look for information to support that. And that's called a confirmation bias. My show isn't just talking about killers. Killer can also mean impressive, right? And so my show, I want to highlight the impressive investigative skills of people that solve these crimes or prevent them, not to glorify killers or serial killers. I want people to get some information out of the show that could be useful for them and actually maybe save their life, right? So today we have a very impressive guest with us, Jason Jensen, a private cold case investigator who is an expert in offender profiling. And he's here with us today. We're going to explore the recent deaths in the Lady Bird River. There are 5 bodies that have washed up in 2023 and 1, maybe 2 coming up this year. And now it's causing widespread panic that there's an alleged serial killer in Austin, Texas. And people want answers. And people have a lot of theories that are blowing up on the internet that people are being roofied at the local bar on Rainy Street. And there's a lot of information, but there's a lot of assumptions that people are making, and a lot of it is incorrect. So I wanted to meet with experts today to talk about it. So we have Jason Jensen and we have Craig Wetterer, forensic psychologist. So we're going to get right into it. Jason, hello.
Hi, Dana. How are you?
Good. I'm glad you're here. So tell me from your perspective, your initial thoughts on this case, looking at some of the deaths that have occurred. What are your thoughts? This is what you do. You solve cold cases.
Well, I really would like to jump on board with this serial killer hysteria. Oh my gosh, it's 6 bodies at the same place. Well, we really got to just look at each case individually and then see if there is some kind of crossover, some similarities between the different crimes before you can jump to some conclusion that there's a single person responsible for them all. For instance, in criminology, which is really the educational background that I have going into this as a private, cold case investigator, is criminology. And the study of criminals is a really good tool to look at future crime to see how they're committed based on historical, empirical evidence. Because the problem that you got is, I'm not a criminal. I don't think like criminals. So in order to really dissect how they do it, why they do it, it takes people such as yourselves, forensic psychologists, as well as someone that studies their behaviors from a criminology side. So looking at this, just taking the basic common sense approach to this, we see, oh my gosh, 6 bodies in Ladybirdlake outside of Austin. And, just from a snapshot, that might seem like it's a common dumping ground of an offender. Much like in, U.S. history in the Seattle area, there was Ted Bundy in the 70s that was dumping bodies in Taylor Mountain. So that standing alone may look like a serial killer is responsible, but, I digress. There's other things that go into a crime to identify who the offender is. Austin is almost 1 million people population. So if you get more than a handful of people with the same idea that I don't want to be found with this body, where shall we dump him? Let's dump him in a lake, someplace out of the area that's not well lit, not well traveled at night. It becomes something that more than one individual thought of, and doesn't mean that it's just one organization or one person.
Let me chime in here because I have a question for you, Jason, about when we look at the totality of what's going on here in Austin. And again, this is just recently in the past 3 years that this has really come to light, where these bodies are being discovered at presumably higher rates than what we maybe historically have noticed. So I'm wondering when we think about things occurring outside of sort of a normal range of probabilities, in other words, what's the average number of bodies? Because we all know that lakes, bodies of water, people drown, right? They fall off watercraft, they fall into the water, when they're under the influence and so on. And that's one of the things that I would like to know is what's the historical average? What's the historical norm for the number of people that are found, or discovered who have drowned in that lake? And I looked for that evidence. I was looking for that earlier and I couldn't find it. So I'm wondering if that's something that you also look at when you're looking at patterns of when for example, when you're seeing bodies showing up in places where historically they've never been, that clearly is outside of what we would see in the normal range of occurrences historically.
Right. That's a very good point, because what you want to learn from like Fish and Game or whoever manages that body of water is if this is uncommon. For starters, you want to know if, historically, if there's a drowning, once a month, then this doesn't sound anything unusual. Now, what's unique about some of these victims that were found there is they suffered other injuries in association with drowning. So that tells me, like, for instance, if one of the victims has a blunt force injury to their head, then it's entirely possible that someone thought they were already dead from the blunt force and to dispose of the body, but they were still, they still had vital signs. And then if you throw anybody live, conscious or not, we don't breathe in the water. We're not fish. If you dump a body into a body of water, they will drown if they're still, breathing. Some of these victims may have been unconscious at the time when they were disposed of in the water, but that doesn't make it unique enough to be a signature that this is the signature of a serial offender. You got to look at the timeline of those particular victims leading up to their disappearance. You have to look at their victimology, their patterns, who they associated with, what their background is, if they're high risk, low risk in their occupations, what kind of recreational activities were they involved in. Some of them are illicit, some of them are, non-threatening. If you're talking a victim that typically is home from 8 p.m. on, they have a different risk factor than if this is a streetwalker and they were last seen at midnight on a racy part of town. So,
yeah,
what we do know is all these are men. We do know that Texas has an immigration problem. So were any of these people robbed and then murdered because they don't want to be detected? We don't know if they were carrying large sums of money, if somebody was desperate recently over the border and wanted to take advantage of someone they ran into. There's a lot that can go into who would do this and why, and that's really the challenge that law enforcement has, not so much connecting dots where dots may not exist.
Right. Well, I think people are very speculative. People are making connections maybe where they don't exist. The media seems to really profit off sensationalizing things all the time, and it's not particularly helpful for law enforcement. There's some frustration with law enforcement. Right now, they're not saying that they are connected. They're not actually giving much information at all. One of the questions I would have would be, the coroner's report, the death investigation, what substances were in their system. I think one of them, there was evidence of alcohol. That's not surprising. A lot of them are walking on Rainy Street from the bar. But I did get new information on one victim, and that it hasn't been public yet. I was on the Nancy Grace show the other day, and a mother to Christopher Clark was on the show, and she divulged that he had PCP in his system. So that was information that was not known that's different than any of the other victims. None of the other victims we know have a drug in their system. But I wanted to ask Craig about PCP and how it's used, because if you go to, I Googled some of these bars, the sidebar in particular, I started Googling all the bars just so I could get a visual image of what if it was like, would I go to that bar? Would I have a drink? What would that look like? Where would I be walking? There's hundreds of reviews for these bars, and particularly the sidebar, where people are posting, don't go there, you're going to get roofied, and on and on and on. It's true, people do get roofied at bars. And a side story was there actually was a mother-daughter team who were working together. The daughter was the getaway driver. Sharon Jacobs was the mom, and her daughter, Tamia Jacobs, worked together. This was in about 2022. She called herself the Love Star. She kind of hit before Valentine's Day, but she robbed multiple victims over the weekends from February 11th to the 13th of 2022. So she actually was flying into Texas and robbing them, and her daughter was posing as a rideshare driver, and there were 6 other women linked to this. They've since been arrested, and so that's where a lot of the speculation has been, because there actually are people that roofie drinks. This isn't related to the current crimes, right? We don't know if it's related. These people have been arrested. They're in jail. But it's not to say that this system doesn't work, right? Drugging and robbing people. But I wanted to ask Craig about the Rohypnol, because there was a place in Texas that was selling it, right price chemicals, and they were selling it as like a household cleaner, which is not something I used to clean with, but apparently it was a lucrative business, like posing as a fireworks company. But there's a component in GHB that you can use, and I'm just wondering if these bodies, if they did get roofied, would it show up? Or because maybe they were, but we don't have that information, because by the time their bodies were found, it's no longer in there.
Yeah. So, well, let me differentiate a couple of things, because you mentioned 2 different drugs. So Rohypnol is one class of drug that I'll speak about. Why am I an expert on this, by the way? Why should I be allowed to talk about this? Oh, that's right.
Because
I teach.
You love to talk about drugs,
Craig. I
love
it. Yeah, I love talking about drugs. So I'm. Well,
yeah.
But I teach psychopharmacology to doctoral students, and I'm also. I just recently finished an advanced degree in clinical psychopharmacology, so I'm planning on becoming a prescribing psychologist. Anyway,
you're a licensed drug dealer.
Well, I'm not licensed yet, because I haven't got my...
You're not licensed yet, but you know all about drugs.
I know a lot. I don't think I know all, but I definitely know a lot. So I just wanted to preface this so that folks don't think that I'm just kind of like a psychologist talking about, areas of medicine that may require, a medical practitioner to talk about. So, okay, there we go. Let's talk about, so you talked about PCP, which is phencyclidine. So PCP, not quite as commonly used today. Now, this is it's classified as a dissociative. So a dissociative drug works very differently than, say, a benzodiazepine drug does, which is what Rohypnol is. But when someone uses, so generally PCP, when it's used non-pharmacologically, because it's an anesthetic, it was used in anesthesia many years ago. But it's a drug of abuse because of its effects that it has, again, on the brain as a dissociative. So it works by causing dissociation in people when they use it. And so oftentimes historically, they would like lace their marijuana, with PCP. They would dip the marijuana into the PCP and then they would smoke it. And it has some pretty profound effects. People who are under the influence of PCP, they can lose contact with reality, so they can dissociate in the sense that they become, we have two types of dissociation. We have depersonalization, we have derealization. So the depersonalization piece is what could be a problem in a situation like this, is because someone can actually disconnect from themselves, and then they lose contact with what's going on, essentially, within their own sense of self, that they can lose contact with what's going on around them as well. So that's why that drug can be very dangerous in these sorts of settings, where if someone, laces or somehow slips them this drug unknowingly and they've never used it before, it can have pretty profound central nervous system effects on them. Now, Rohypnol is a little different. Now, Rohypnol acts more as a sedative. So PCP doesn't really have the sedating component to it like Rohypnol does. PCP causes the dissociation. It can actually cause a lot of agitation in people as well when they dissociate. So dealing with people on PCP can be very dangerous just because of the anesthetic quality of the drug and what it's doing. They oftentimes have a much higher pain threshold, so they're not going to feel pain sensation like a normal person that's not under the influence would. So that's why dealing with someone that's on PCP can be very dangerous if they become violent. But with Rohypnol, it's very different, because with Rohypnol, that's a benzodiazepine. So what that's going to do is that's going to really sedate the person, right? It's working on those GABA receptors, and it can be very, very sedating to the degree, depending on the dose, to the point where someone can become unconscious. Literally, they lose consciousness because of the dose-response relationship of that drug. So that's the difference between those. So those are, Rohypnol and GHB, a lot of those are used in the party scene frequently, along with ketamine and Molly. A lot of these drugs are frequently seen in party scene activities.
Can you talk about Butanediol?
Yeah, so it's one of the it's a precursor to GHB is what you're speaking about. And so and GHB is a little bit different than the other two drugs that I just spoke about. So let me just maybe talk more about GHB, right, specifically, because GHB and what you're talking about is a precursor to GHB. And I think that was the cleaning company that we're speaking about in Texas it wasn't a cleaning company. I think it was a fireworks company, but they were actually selling the precursor, and it has the same effect that Rohypnol would have, or a similar effect, because it's working on those GABA receptors, just like Rohypnol does.
So it looks like it's BDO.
Yeah, so that's a precursor to GHB. So it's not the full GHB drug itself, but it's a precursor to it. But it can have those similar effects when ingested. When someone takes it. In other words, it can cause someone to become disabled to the degree, again, depending on the dosing of it, because it's really targeting those GABA receptors in the brain, and it's causing it's very sedative, and it also has an anesthetic property to it as well. And this is why these drugs are used, commonly they're called like the date rape drugs, because they will incapacitate somebody to the degree to where they're not, capable of necessarily fighting back, right? Because of that sedation.
Yeah, and this all makes me think, if I had been slipped some drug like that, well, I could fall and hurt my head or incur an injury. So I don't know whether these victims had blunt force trauma or what it was caused by. I don't have information from the autopsy, but it is possible that people could fall and sustain an injury afterwards. But the motive, it doesn't appear to be sexual. So I don't have any information regarding that. We have these victims, the unknown cause of death, who they're saying allegedly drowned.
I just wanted to clarify because you were asking about back to the precursor to GHB, right? Is this Butanediol? It's a diol. It's kind of a hard one to pronounce, but that is that precursor agent that, when converted, the body metabolizes it actually into GHB. So in other words, you take the precursor, it's like what we call a prodrug, and then the body then converts it to GHB. So it then becomes GHB once it's metabolized in the body. So it can be just as powerful.
No, that's really important to understand. So the man that was responsible for selling this substance, Jake Ellis Daughtry, the owner of Jake's Fireworks, he was sentenced to federal prison 4 drug trafficking violations in Texas. So as far as I know, he's incarcerated. But I do have questions about, I think that's really interesting that this drug was so prevalent and available and being sold in Austin, Texas. And I mean, I'm curious for how long or how far-reaching its effects were going back to, I mean, how far back, right? It being so easily obtained.
We don't have the toxicology reports on a lot of these cases, right? They're not releasing some of that stuff, but obviously in some cases with some of these drugs, they metabolize very quickly. Their half-lives are very short. And so in some cases, this is why you may not see traces depending on how much time has lapsed from when the drug was administered in terms of how fast it's metabolized. So it could have had the effect on someone and then, they end up getting, if they were killed, they get killed. And then that drug then has already been metabolized out of the body. So it may not show up in toxicology screen.
Right. And that being said, if the body, is deceased really quickly, then toxicology is more successful because
Yes.
you don't have that chance to metabolize or to dissipate. You haven't peed it through your bladder or exhaled it through your breath or filtered it through your liver. So there's other ways that it can be lost. But if you're killed or die quickly, then it kind of locks in the toxicology, right?
That's absolutely correct, because remember, the body is continuously, or the liver generally is continuously metabolizing any drug that you're taking. Now, there's very few drugs that are metabolized in the renal system, the kidney, but a majority of all drugs are metabolized hepatically through the liver. So when if someone is killed, shortly after ingesting a drug that has by the way, these drugs also work pretty fast, so they're fast acting. For example, the Rohypnol works pretty quickly. So the onset is generally pretty quick, but the second that that drug becomes absorbed right in the system, those pharmacokinetics start kicking in, and you get metabolism starting right away. And so if someone is killed, within a couple of hours of ingesting a drug like this, then you're right, they're going to still have that drug is still going to be present in systemic circulation. It'll probably be, active metabolites will probably still be in the bloodstream and in other organs as well. And don't forget, some of these drugs also can show up in hair too. So there's other ways of determining whether, drug was present or is present in someone's body, even if they were killed quickly, if a lot of time had passed. In other words, so that the drugs would have metabolized out and cleared, either through the liver or through the kidneys. There's still the hair, right? So
I would think that if it's part of a scheme to roofie somebody or slip them any kind of drug in order to take advantage of them because they're now vulnerable, in a vulnerable state because they're either unconscious due to the intoxication or whatnot, then that would probably be a signature of this type of crime or of this offender. But if they're all unique and they're all different, well, then, that kind of makes the serial theory less likely.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there are rare cases, aren't there, Jason, where you will have a serial killer that will change modus. In other words, they'll have a pattern that they generally will engage in as far as how they kill or how they, whether they take, things from the body or leave things at the scene. But then they switch it up because, again, they're trying to distract or to make it look like it's not part of a pattern.
Right, exactly. Because, for instance, the Golden State Killer, they didn't realize that the criminal up in one part of the state was not connected to the other until they got DNA matching connecting them all, and that's where the name Golden State Killer came from, because there was, the what was it, the Visalia Strangler, and then there was the rapist up there in Santa Clara or whatever. So they had different names for the different areas that he was committing, but as he evolved, his criminal behavior got more intense, because at first he started off in Wetterer just being ransacker going through when he was a police officer there in charge of the burglary section. He was breaking into homes and basically ransacking and rummaging through panty drawers and things like that. But then as he, moved on and was no longer satisfied with those kinds of offenses, it escalated. And then once he got a taste of blood, then it was, now he's a murderer. So
that's a prime example, and I'm very familiar with that case only because that case was actually, the tail end of that case was still active when I was in the Sheriff's Academy in Sacramento many years ago. We'll just say it was many years ago. How about we just leave it at that? Okay. But I remember the lead sex assault detective that was handling that case had come in and was teaching our sex assault investigation block. And that was a very salient, topic that or a piece of the training that we got was this guy's MO and his pattern. And he was very versatile in terms of how he committed crimes, because he would move to different regions and modus changed a little bit, although there were some common ways in which he was perpetrating these crimes, like putting dinner plates on the male to make sure he didn't move, and if he did move, he told them that he would kill them and things like that. But that was they didn't put those pieces together until much later. In the investigation.
It took DNA to say, hey, these are all common criminal here.
And it was familial DNA. And what's really crazy about this is that this guy was living in the very community. He was living in Citrus Heights, which is like in Sacramento County. It's an incorporated city now, but he was living in Citrus Heights the entire time. After he was fired he worked at 2 police departments, and he worked at the Auburn Police Department for a period of time, and then he got fired there. And he was working, I think he worked at Atwater first, which is another small agency, but he got fired at Auburn for committing a petty theft of all things, which is very interesting.
Yeah, he got the dog repellent and the hammer.
Yeah.
And he stole it from a store.
This case or the situation in Austin is very it's perplexing. One of the things I noticed that I'm wondering if and again, this is probably, Jason, this is your wheelhouse and your expertise. What I noticed, I watched a documentary that wherein it was actually pretty well done. It seemed to be fairly unbiased, and it chronicled through all of these people that have turned up deceased in the lake, presumably drowned, most of them, obviously. And what I noticed when I saw, because of course he's showing the pictures of these men, these are all male up until I think this year, maybe we have a female, but I don't know if that's related, but they all have a similar appearance. They all have dark hair. They're not all Hispanic Latino, but they are all, I noticed that all of them, they all have dark hair. Like there's no light hair, light-skinned men in any of these victims that I'm seeing. They're all dark hair. And again, this could be just a consequence. This could be the demographics of that area, maybe that's contributing to that. But no, some of these people actually were visiting Austin. They weren't living in Austin. They were like in town. One of them was in town for his daughter's competition, and he ended up in the lake. But they all had dark hair. So I don't know. I noticed that. Did you notice that at all, Dana?
Well, I noticed they were all men in a certain age range, 20 to 30s, which, I'm a woman, so I always think about when women go missing, then it's my fear, like that's how I would get killed. And so now there's been a shift, because we are seeing different groups of people that are going missing, and where they've thought it's a serial killer or something, and it's linked to dating apps. And I know we talked about Passport Bros, where 30 men were killed, and it was actually linked to dating apps. And historically, men haven't always been afraid to go on dating apps. You're just looking for a hookup, but it's getting deadly. But at first glance, they thought it was women that were roofing them and killing them, which, yes, the woman was sent to be your date, the beautiful woman that you were seeking. They bamboozled you, right, to meet in public. But all those men, what got them caught in that situation was they were flaunting their wealth. They told everyone where they're going. They had tons of money. They were millionaires. And they were targeted. It was an organized group that is working behind scenes to get them lured out to rob them, and then we're getting killed. And listen to some of the survivors. There was one that survived, and he knew he was getting drugged, and he went to leave right away to get out. But it was a setup. The car wasn't even an Uber driver, right? It's part of the plan. And so that made me think of the mom-daughter team. It wasn't just a mom-daughter. There was 6 other Black women behind it. But they also, in their team, had the driver, a female driver, posing, as a registered rideshare driver. So I would just caution anyone. I've always been paranoid about getting in Ubers, any car. I don't get in cars with strangers. You should be the one using your own Uber app, and then you are verifying the car you're getting in. I wouldn't, just because you're on a date with someone and they say they've called a driver, and how can you verify that? And that is, I think, really, I want people to think about that, because now you're in a car and you're driving, you pass out, and then they wake up, or you don't wake up. To sidestep, there was people in New York, Hell's Kitchen, a bunch of men that were getting murdered, right? But the motive in those cases was robbery. One of the things I would like to know is sexual assault. Were any of these men sexually assaulted?
To my understanding, there was no evidence of any kind of sexual assault, but it's harder to determine sexual assault of a male than it is of a female, depending on the type of, if there was sodomy involved, then sure. But guess what? That also leads to the reason why someone would dispose of their victim in a body of water, because they're thinking, if I dispose, my victim in water, even in a burning car, for instance, they're hoping to destroy or compromise any DNA evidence. And the more sophisticated the community becomes about DNA, so does that level of understanding for offenders. So it's only eventual that, people will think that they're getting away with a crime if they think they can destroy or compromise DNA findings.
If I'm a killer and I'm going to dispose of a body, maybe now's a good time to just dump it in there. It's going to, other bodies already floating up, other people could commit a crime and throw it in the mix.
And this is in the middle of an urban city of over 2 million people, or over 1 million people in the city limits, I think, in Austin. So, putting yourself in the mind, let's assume these are connected, and this is a serial killer that's doing this. I'm not saying it is. I'm just saying let's do a thought experiment. If you're a serial killer, right, and you really don't necessarily want to get caught, if you've killed this person, why would you dump the body in an urban lake? Why wouldn't you take it to a remote place and either bury it or, dismember it or burn it or whatever to destroy evidence? Because, we know that when a body goes into a body of water, it's going to rise to the surface at some point, because as the body decomposes, right, those gases inside the body start to cause, it creates buoyancy, and the body will start to rise unless you weight it down. It's going to pop up relatively, quickly. It's not going to be necessarily right away, but you know what I mean? So if I was targeting these guys and I was wanting to, for whatever reason, again, motive, why are you targeting men, if this is true, men in the 20s and 30s, and they all have dark hair, but, and why would you then just dump them in a urban lake and not somewhere else where it's more concealed?
Well, the reason why I would think that an urban lake is ideal is because you're not going to be missed as much as you would if you went to a remote area away from town where someone's going to not have a good track of your location. So, for instance, if the lake's on the way from point A to point B, then you were not missed in that travel. where, yeah, I left the bar at 6:30, I got home by 7, and it doesn't look like there was a huge disruption of your travel home. But if you disappear for 3 hours, no one knows where you're at, your phone's turned off, you start to stand out if someone comes around questioning. So the urban disposal, whether it be a dumpster, urban lake, behind the bar or something, becomes convenient because you're not missed. The only thing that you have to worry about is getting caught. Someone seeing you in the disposal process. If there's a surveillance footage of you behind the bar and you got this big black bag and you throw it in the dumpster and they can see your car, they see what you look like, and at some point they flash it on the news and someone goes, "Hey, Bob, that's you."
Yeah.
Well, then you're caught.
Well, that's your car. Yeah.
Look, that's your car. So, but if you can get away of the disposal itself, then it's one of a million people that could have done it, as opposed to, well, you're his best friend. Where were you for 6 hours yesterday during this window? And so, that really becomes the reason in my mind why they would do an urban disposal like this, is because it's convenient and they're not going to be noticed for some period of time disappearing.
Yes, I agree with that, because that, again, that's setting up the alibi, right? In terms of because when investigators come around, well, can you account for these 2 hours that and all of a sudden maybe you turned your cell phone off. I don't know, there was a case that happened where a cell phone was turned off, at 3:30 in the morning or whatever, and then it popped back on again. And 4 people were murdered. That assumes, again, I guess, that the killer was mingling with these victims, at the bar or wherever they were at before. But if it's somebody from, let's just say this person is just, they're not commingling, or they're not interacting with the victim necessarily, but they're waiting for the victim to leave, perhaps, and they don't have a cell phone on them, so they're not being tracked, right? And, so that might be a little different, I would think, because then the accountability piece, may not be as big of an issue. As far as...
and if I was an Austin detective working on these cases, I'd be more interested in what kind of vehicles did these guys drive? Did they stand out in the parking lot of the bar? Was someone casing the parking lot and nabbed them on their way out? It may not even be involving the people mixing up with them inside the club, or the waiter, waitress, help, or whatever, because those are the people that would see the customers and see who flashes cash. So you might assume it's somebody inside the bar, but if they drive unique, high luxury vehicles or something, well, that would make them a target outside the bar, and someone's going to wait for them to leave.
And maybe some of these guys weren't the intended target. You got roofied and realized this guy has no cash, or he took the drink, or right, just assuming, that's part of the setup. Then what do you do with someone? I don't know the motive. I don't know if they were robbed or what if they were wealthy or not. But what if somebody thought they were going to rob them, and that person actually had nothing on them? And it's like, this guy just had nothing. So it's confusing. It would be confusing because there's no transfer of money, and so maybe they just kicked him to the river.
Certainly it is
could that
possible.
be possible?
I think the disposal becomes more part of the crime if there's actual transfer of trace evidence or something. If I go hands-on or something, then I'm going to be concerned about disposing you like in a body of water. If, on the other hand, I just steal your wallet and we don't touch otherwise, I would leave you to die in the alleyway, in the parking lot or whatever, because no one's going to know that it was you. They're not going to be able to tie you to that crime. They're going to look at people that are familiar with that victim first, because they're going to eliminate family members. Was there any just violence in the family? Was there any recent changes in their relations, divorce, cheating or something that would make them a victim of somebody familial, and then they go in outer rings of less and less likely scenarios. But they're looking at, there's a common thread here, the rainy street and things like that is what they're thinking, is there's connection there. And then they got a disposal site over by the lake. So it looks like they start from one area and they end in one area, that there's a common denominator there. But, you can have more than one offender, if it's for like robberies or something, operating in the same, general area. And then if somebody from reporting comes up with a copycat idea, it's like, wow, they got away with it. Maybe we should do it. And so then it becomes more and more other offenders that are copying, because they're thinking, well, once they identify the original offender, I'll be scot-free, because they're going to pin all these crimes on the one offender, not all of us.
Exactly. Or even taking a look at, say, for example, they're looking for a woman, or the women, those 6 Black women that were involved in a ring. So you're making an assumption there's a woman. Everyone's looking for someone else. That's,
right. They're
that's
looking
the
for
perfect
women.
crime. You get everyone else looking at something else while you're over here doing this, right? You want everyone to think it's this. You would want everyone to think it's a serial killer if it was just you robbing people. You don't want people to know your motive, right? I mean, to catch you, to get it back to you. Okay, I was going to say, one of them, they watched a man stumble into the river himself. So he was inebriated and stumbled into the river and fell and drowned. So, well, he could have been murdered, right? I mean, I don't know what his toxicology test was, but it can certainly make it confusing for law enforcement.
Well, and that's the other thing too about Austin generally, that I'm only vaguely familiar with it. I've been there once. So this Rainy Street is an entertainment district that's part of downtown Austin, right? And so there's been this surge of bars and nightclubs and things that have been established there. So then it brings me back to this question about when did this area become so, hoppin', right? Because again, if you have all of these people now coming into this central entertainment district, you're likely going to start those base rates. In other words, the prevalence of like these drownings that are happening are just as a consequence of these changes in the nature of the downtown, right? So, 20 years ago, I bet you Rainy Street wasn't, as hopping as it is today, right? Or even 10 years ago. I mean, I don't know how long it's been this sort of entertainment hub that it is now, but that's how it's been classified as. It's kind of that destination place that a lot of younger people will go, to basically party and, drink and all of that stuff. And so a lot of these urban cities have these, entertainment districts now. And so again, going back to these probabilities and like, what were the historical averages of like people ending up, in this lake, which by the way is a non-natural. It's like this was formed as a part of a dam that was built back in the 1960s. That's why they named it after, Lady Bird, Johnson, which was Lyndon B. Johnson's wife. I don't know if you know that, but that's what the lake's named after.
Yeah, it was named after a woman. Maybe that's why they think it's a female serial killer, like giving ode to the Lady Lake, So I would say if you're going out, I wouldn't go out drinking alone. Never. Go in a group. I mean, but if you think about the people who do go out alone, right? You're going to meet someone for a date. That's typically what happens. So I would be curious who they were meeting, right? Because these were single males.
Yeah, one of them I recall again from this documentary. Right? One of them actually had.
So they weren't.
This was not. It was a few years ago, but one of them actually wasn't. He was with a friend or with friends, and he reported that he had been drugged or had been given some type, whether it was GHB or whether it was Rohypnol. He doesn't know what it was, but it absolutely disabled him. And if it wasn't for his friend helping him, like he said, he would not have probably made it back to his house. But yeah, I think a lot of them, that's another thing that, Jason probably could give an opinion on here, is that, like in victimology, what were these guys, most of them like going to these places, these establishments by themselves? And I think at least some of them were. So is that possibly, could that be why they were targeted if this is in fact part of a series?
Well, just because we don't really know, we can answer that. Well, yes, it's possible, but, we don't know for sure. And we certainly wouldn't want to, mislead the public into thinking it's just one likelihood, because, we want people to keep vigilant and look at all the possibilities, because it will take one out of place person that, if they call it in, they may actually catch the guy before someone else, or person before someone else ends up dead. So like Dana says, use the buddy system, go out there, still live your lives. But if something seems out of place, don't hesitate to report it. Write down a plate number or something like that, because those are the things that identify suspects. If you can identify a vehicle, a plate number, get some kind of description that can lead to something, and hell, everybody has a phone. Take a quick video or snapshot of it. Anything that really helps get the evidence out there without having to worry about faulty memories. I got 3 of the 7 numbers of the license plate. A phone, a picture isn't going to forget.
Yeah, there's so much video surveillance now, everywhere. Well, just, with Ring cameras and all the things that people have at their, businesses and establishments, you would think that, again, in a place like that, there should be plenty. And I'm sure the, police they went through all of those, for some of these cases, they went through and looked at those videos, all that video surveillance, to see if there was anything unusual going on, with these victims that ended up in the lake, or the river, actually, because there's a river that feeds into the lake.
Yeah, we're going to have to put a Ring camera up at the Lady River. So I would think that law enforcement would be patrolling the area, install new cameras at the trailhead, increase lighting on the sidewalks. Are there street lamps, having video cameras? All of those things would be good for crime prevention and safety measures. My advice is if you're going out, I think people maybe they don't think like you and I, where I'm always think like a criminal. I don't want to be a victim, right? So I take a lot of precautions, but now we're seeing an increase in crime where single men are killed. So, a lot of times where women are killed, it's sexual assault. So we don't know whether there's sexual assault in these cases, but I would always be prepared. And I don't recommend going out drinking or flaunting your wealth, or I would just be careful if you are using dating apps or meeting up with people. It's dangerous out there.
It's a tragedy for families to lose loved ones. And in our professions, we hate to see these things happen, but I don't see anything, in our future of humanity that's going to cause it to stop just yet. So don't make yourself a victim. Don't, do whatever you can to prevent you yourself from being a victim. But aside from that, we're here to talk about it.
And Jason, where can people find you if they want to hire you to help solve a cold case?
Well, the easiest way to find me would be my website at jensenprivateinvestigations.com. There's also my cold case page, which is jensen-coldcases.com, or any of the socials if you just look up my name, Jason K. Jensen.
All right, Jason, I'm excited. I know we have you on another episode, and hopefully coming up in March, we have another episode, maybe on TV, where we cover the Brian Kohlberger case. So in closing, Dr. Wetterer, where can people find you if they want to hire you?
My website, I guess, is the easiest way to find me. CarsonPsychological.com. So Carson and then psychological.com. People misspell that all the time. So I should probably change the website address. That's where I can be found.
All right, guys, episodes are on YouTube if you want to watch us, and everything that you need to know, you can find us on Killer Psychologist Podcast.com. That's a wrap. Thanks for listening. Killer Psychologist video episodes are now on YouTube, and you can post your responses there. For episode details and merch, check out killerpsychologistpodcast.com. And for forensic services, you can book online at psychologydr.com. That's psychologydoctor.com.